I'm Leslie Volkar, the Director of Communications for Colorado Open Lands. I've been in this role for over a decade, and I'm always looking for ways to make land and water conservation work more real to the people of Colorado. In talking with some of my colleagues, we thought a podcast would be a great way to take a deeper look into some of the issues around conservation in Colorado. And thus, Landlines was born. I'll be interviewing our expert staff, partners, and community members to talk about how conservation gets done in Colorado. Now, friends of Colorado Open Lands know that a lot of our land and water protection work is done on private lands. But why are private lands important? Why should people care about land that they may never see, touch, or experience? For our first episode, I thought that would be important groundwork to lay for the rest of the series. So I wanted to go straight to the source from someone who makes the case for private land conservation every day. And that's COL's president and CEO, Tony Caligiuri. I sat down with Tony in May in the Colorado Open Lands Lakewood headquarters to talk more. Tony, thanks for joining me today. How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
Excellent. So what I really wanted to get started with is we know that Colorado Open Lands does a lot of work on private land. And before we jump into why that's important, why people like it, let's talk about what it is. What is private land, in your words, Tony?
Sure. So, private land is, the obvious answer is land that's owned by private individuals, farmers, ranchers, homeowners, all kinds of folks. And it's really the land that's not owned by government entities like the federal, state, and municipalities.
And do you have any sense of what percentage is owned privately versus owned by, federal, state, and local entities there?
Yeah, so Colorado has about 66.4 million acres, and about 57% of that, or 38 million acres, is privately owned.
So when we're talking about private land versus public, kind of writ large, what kind of features are we looking at? What are the land forms or the land uses?
Sure. So a lot of the private land is actually, a lot of the Eastern Plains is privately owned. A lot of the most buildable, accessible lands in Colorado are privately owned. You think about public lands, you think more about the rugged mountains and some of the scenic features like the Colorado National Monument or canyons or mountain ranges like that. They tend to be publicly owned lands or public lands. Part of the reason why private lands ended up in the hands that they did and that they have many of the features that they have is you have to think back on how private lands were actually acquired and settled. And that was primarily through the Homestead Act. So there were really, over the course of about 85 years, there were about 22 million acres of the private lands in Colorado were acquired through the Homestead Act. And what people were doing were they were going and claiming seemingly unclaimed lands in Colorado, and what they were looking for were certain features, and those are sort of the why private lands are defined the way they are now. There were things like close to waterways for transportation, places that were accessible, that had good soils, that had good wildlife habitat, because the primary food source in Colorado, especially in the winter, is from hunting. So that's the reason why private lands tend to be those accessible, good water, good soils, good wildlife areas in the state, which turn out to be the most important lands to protect some of our natural resources, including wildlife.
And can you tell me, of the private land in the state, what are the common uses? Is it just, is it all housing density, or what's going on private land?
Yeah, so I think that obviously private land, there's a lot of dense development, housing developments, commercial development on private land. That's most of the Denver metro area, the Fort Collins, most of the Front Range cities. You think of private lands as being parsed up into 1-acre lots, half-acre lots. What we're really paying attention to at Colorado Open Lands are those privately owned parcels that have a lot of benefit and conservation value that are still relatively large, intact landscapes. And those tend to be primarily farms and ranches that provide some open space. And so those are the private lands that we focus most on. So I'd say probably 80% of the land that we work to conserve would be what we would consider working lands. So those are lands that, while they do provide scenic views and good water and important wildlife habitat, they're also working farms and ranches at the same time. And so those tend to be the kinds of lands that we spend most of our time working to conserve.
So when I think about lands that are large, intact farms and ranches, that's where wildlife is happiest. Is that right?
It is. And I mean, it's a sort of a chicken and an egg situation where it happens to be where the wildlife was prior to settlement of Colorado in the 17 and 1800s. So that wildlife was there, and that's why some of those lands were actually settled, because it was the proximity to the wildlife. It was the wildlife habitat on those lands. And in most cases, what we see is those working lands working in harmony with the wildlife that's on them.
Right, because, as I've said once or twice in my role here, elk can't read a no trespassing sign. They'll jump right from public to private, and it's important to keep those corridors open for them. So I want to talk a little bit about what we call in the land conservation business conservation values. And these are the recognized values designated by the IRS that a conservation easement needs to have one or more of. It might be two or more of. Do you know that?
It's at least one.
At least one. These are things like productive agriculture, wildlife habitat, scenic view sheds. So can you talk, Tony, about why many of the best conservation values are found on private lands?
Sure. So again, just going back to referencing the way lands were settled through the Homestead Act, if you imagine yourself coming across the country 150 years ago and you had an opportunity to choose 160 acres to settle on, what are the features that you're going to look for? And it is those accessibility, scenic views, good soils, wildlife habitat. That's really where it goes back to the intersection between the conservation values and the private land ownership in Colorado. As you mentioned, the IRS is the governing agency when it comes to conservation easements, because most conservation easements are donated. Those are donated development rights, and in order to get a tax benefit through the IRS, you have to meet certain criteria. And so the IRS is really the agency that determined officially which of the 4 conservation values have to be contained in a parcel of land in order for that donated conservation easement to receive any kind of tax benefit. So while there are some, beautiful backyards and lawns in Colorado, if they don't have certain features like key wildlife habitat, provides scenic views for the public, working agricultural lands, important wildlife habitat, and things like that, even public recreation and education is a conservation value that can be protected. So we look for one of those characteristics on the land to make sure that that conservation easement that we do can qualify for a tax benefit. And that's really a driver for our work.
So we know that we in Colorado, we love our outdoor spaces. People love hiking, biking, skiing, everything like that. And people may think that that public lands are where the wildlife are and where they congregate. But that's not true in a lot of cases, I think, because when you reach a critical mass of people recreating in public spaces, talk to me about where those animals go.
Sure. So that's definitely one of the benefits of private land conservation, is that it provides a refuge for wildlife when there are impacts from human recreation. And so that's one of the things that we look for, are places that are especially near public lands. How can we provide protected private lands as a refuge for that wildlife? Land conservation is often part of, but not completely, a tool for public access on land. So a lot of the lands that we conserve do have public access, but very often land does not necessarily have public access just because it's protected with a conservation easement. Because oftentimes we're looking for those places that offer refuge for wildlife. I say often that private land conservation actually requires a little bit of humility, because not every acre of land should be designated for public recreation, even if it's protected. And that's really sometimes seen as a conflict for folks that want to say that if there's public incentives to protect land, there should be public access. But often we have to think about beyond just public use. We have to think about wildlife. We have to think about clean water, other benefits to the public that don't necessarily include public recreation.
Right. And so something that we've talked about at Colorado Open Lands and have used as actually a theme for a few newsletters is the concept of when you see conserved private land, what do you not see there? What is missing and what's left? Can you speak a little bit to that concept?
Sure. I think that what we figured out when we're trying to actually talk about the work that we do, oftentimes it's difficult to demonstrate our success when someone looks out and sees that there's no change. So many times what folks are looking for when they want to see the impact of a nonprofit is, what do they see? And ironically, with us, it's oftentimes what you don't see. So we came up with that catchphrase, do you like what you don't see, just to help express the impact that we're able to have on landscapes where you can imagine what it would look like if it were not protected. And so that helps us express the impact of our work in a little bit more effective way for the public.
And it was fun. So I want to move on a little bit to the public interest. And in Colorado, the voters and the legislature has expressed their interest in private land conservation in a few different ways. The population, as a group has agreed that private land conservation has value. Colorado has a variety of incentives for conserving private land that there are actually some great tools in the toolbox that a lot of other states don't have. And one of those is Great Outdoors Colorado. Now, that was passed by a ballot initiative in 1992 with 58% of voters in favor to create an entity to take a portion of the Colorado State Lottery proceeds and devote that to open space, parks, trails, and conservation. So talk to me a little bit about how GOCO supports Colorado Open Lands private land conservation work.
Sure. I think the point that you made is really important. Colorado has possibly the most robust set of incentives to incentivize private land conservation in the nation, and we are truly a leader in that field, and I think it's something that Coloradans should be very not only proud of, but also vigilant about protecting, because it's the reason why we have so much protected open space. The Great Outdoors Colorado incentive, which does provide some funding to help protect open space, both public open space and private open space. That's a very unique set of incentives that almost no other state in the nation has. And it's part of the toolbox that we use. And it's something that the voters have continually supported, and we're very pleased and proud that our voting public values conservation, land and water conservation.
Great. And then I know another tool in our toolbox is the Colorado State Conservation Easement Tax Credit. Now, I believe that was passed or started being used in the year 2000. And I'm going to back up to an old conservation saw that where we like to talk about property rights as a bundle of sticks. So if you're a private property owner, you have a various suite of rights that you could exercise on your property. You could sell it, you could subdivide it, you could develop it, a variety of things that you have. When somebody undergoes a conservation easement with a land trust or group like ours, they are, in some cases, often cases, donating their development and subdivision rights to the land trust. Now, there is a value placed on those donated rights, a value that is determined by an appraiser, and then the conservation tax credit in Colorado is a credit for a portion of the donated value of those rights. Tony, did I get that right?
Absolutely.
All right. Tell me a little bit about how many Colorado open lands or what percentage of our projects use that tax credit and what's special about the tax credit.
Sure. So I think that this is a tax credit that you can claim when you donate a conservation easement, as you said. But the most important part of that tax credit and what makes it it very unique in the nation is that it's transferable, which means if you can't use a tax credit, if you don't have a lot of state tax liability, you can actually sell that credit for cash. The importance of that is that it makes land conservation accessible to a much more diverse audience than just folks who have a lot of tax liability or folks who make a lot of money. The transferable tax credit allows folks that are land rich, cash poor, which is a large majority of agricultural producers in Colorado, where they don't actually make a lot of money, although they may own land that's worth a lot of money. So this allows them to donate their development rights and then get a tax credit for that. And if they don't have a lot of revenue with a tax liability, they can sell that, and then they can actually realize some of the financial asset that they have in the form of a tax credit. Most often, this money goes right back into an agricultural operation. It might expand the operation. It might modernize the operation. It might allow the next generation to stay on that farm or ranch by maybe building a house or doing upgrades that'll help the margins improve on their agricultural production. So this transferable tax credit is possibly the most utilized tool in the toolbox as far as incentives go. And I'd say 80% of the conservation easements that we do actually utilize that transferable tax credit.
So that's a huge boon to incentivize conservation in the state. However, because it was created by the legislature, it can be adjusted by the legislature or potentially removed by the legislature. And I just want to talk for a minute about a study. You know, we in this industry, we think that we make the case very well for our existence and the future of our industry, but it's good to have facts and data on your side as well. So in 2017, there was a study that the industry supported through Colorado State University, which analyzed conserved lands in Colorado that have used the state tax credit, and they actually put a dollar amount value on things that conserved lands provide, like carbon sequestration, soil erosion control, flood risk reduction, recreation and tourism, and water quality. And I just want to read a quote from the executive summary of that report. The CSU team found state investments in conservation easements had conserved nearly 1.5 million acres of identified crucial habitat, nearly 300,000 acres of prime farmland, 270,000 acres of elk severe winter range, 4,100 miles of stream, creek, or river frontage, and 19% of the Gunnison sage-grouse production areas that occur on private land. CSU estimates Colorado residents had received an estimated $5.5 to $13.7 billion of economic benefits from land conserved by conservation easements on investments of roughly $1.1 billion since 1995. This represented roughly $4 to $12 of public benefits provided by conserved land, private conserved land, for each $1 invested in real 2017 dollars. Give me your reaction to that statement.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's a lot of attention paid to the state government on how do we protect and enhance rural economies around the state. And so when you think about investing in rural economies, the conservation easement tax credit is actually one of the most economical ways, because for every dollar that goes into that tax credit, as you say, we're getting $4 to $12 back out for those rural communities, as compared to just making a dollar for dollar contribution to a rural community. So really, the conservation easement tax credit is an incredibly efficient way, and it's leveraged very well. The other economic impact I would, though, also draw attention to for rural economies is that when you conserve working ag lands, what you're doing is you're helping to create a permanent critical mass of working lands, which is really important in a rural community. Most ranchers and farmers would agree you cannot ranch and farm on an island. You have to have a critical mass of working lands around you, because otherwise you won't have the seed sales, you won't have the implement sales shops, you won't have the large animal husbandry professionals, all the things that go into ranching and farming. a single rancher farm can't support. You need to have a critical mass of that in order to keep that entire rural economy functioning. Even the local banks and the local sales and shops, they all depend on that farm and ranch income to survive. A really good example of a success story in this is the Gunnison Valley. To date, we and our partner organizations have conserved over 50% of the working lands in the Gunnison Valley, which means that those lands can remain in farming and ranching forever. And that's really important because farmers and ranchers are not going to make future investments in their communities and on their ranches and farms unless they know that the entire community is going to be viable. If they know that they're going to be surrounded by condominiums and recreation and things like that, they might decide not to farm anymore. They might not to make any more investments in their community. So this is a really good success story from an economic perspective, not just an open space and wildlife perspective.
Indeed. And, what's coming to mind for me is there's a woman named Lori Weigel. She's a pollster with Newbridge Strategies, and she does a poll every year, the name of which is escaping me at the moment, but she always asks Coloradans various questions about the state, conservation, and natural and open spaces. And something that she told me once in a sidebar conversation that she always asks is, should public lands in Colorado be managed by the state or by the federal government? And people always say the state until she asks them, okay, does the state want to pay for that? And then people change their minds a little bit. But something that one of our board members said to me very early on in my career at COL was that he supports private land conservation because it's much cheaper for Colorado to have open spaces that are managed privately than for the state to take over, paying for rangers and people to do restoration and cleanup and land management. So I think that we can agree, at least those of us in this podcasting room right now, that private land conservation is a really good investment for the people of Colorado.
Absolutely. If you have an acre of land that you'd like to see remain open, it costs us and our colleague organizations about $75 to conserve a single acre of land. I've yet to find an acre of land in Colorado where you could buy it for $75. So from an economic standpoint, it's absolutely a steal for the public that want to see open space, protected rivers and streams and things like that. From an economic perspective, it's a really good deal. But the second part of that is also that when you think about managing the land, not just the cost of managing the land, Colorado land managers are really great, professional, knowledgeable people. But in the end, the best steward of acres of private land are the people that grew up on it, that are on it every day, that see it every day. They know exactly how it works. And so we also benefit just from an ecological perspective to know that the people that know the land the best are the ones that are actually managing it. And that's why when you do a conservation easement, that land does stay in private hands, and it's the landowner's responsibility to manage it. And the kind of folks that do conservation easements are people that really do care about the health of the land. So it's not only an economic win, but it's also an ecological win.
Absolutely. Now, for the next section, I want to get a little personal. This is a touchy-feely space where Tony's most comfortable, right?
Absolutely.
So I have to just throw out the idea that you've probably seen more conserved private land than almost everybody in Colorado. Every time we close a conservation easement, Tony goes to that closing meeting, and you've been kind of just all over the place. And something that I feel like is a pretty well accepted idea is the fact that land holds memory. And we have those of us in Colorado have memories of public land. We've all, hiked the same trails, seen the same views, but I think private land often has a lot of really interesting stories to tell. And I'm going to ask Tony to share a couple memories. I'm going to share some of my own. I want to ask you, Tony, if you can tell me a story that a landowner shared with you about the history of their property that really sticks out in your mind.
Sure, I'll say it in a general sense. Seeing these lands and hearing the stories and meeting the families that work these lands, especially when you're at that table signing the final conservation easement with them, is the most rewarding part of this job. It's the thing that I love the most about working here. I've met some of the most stoic, quiet ranchers who, when they sign that form, the knowledge that that ranch or farm is going to be protected in perpetuity, I've seen them break down and weep, and it's just a very moving experience to see when they realize that their life's dream is going to be preserved in that way. When I think about historical uses of land and the history of land, as you say, especially with families, the first thing that comes to mind for me are some of the acequia farmers in the San Luis Valley. Some of these families have been farming the same land longer than Colorado has been a state. So there is some extraordinary history tied to the land in Colorado. There's an irrigation ditch in the town of San Luis, and there's a plaque commemorating the establishment of this ditch. It's called the People's Ditch, and it actually is older than the state of Colorado. It's the first water right that was established in Colorado. And when you read the names of the families on the ditch plaque that commemorates its establishment, those are the exact same families in that community that are working today. So just that history, that 5, 6, 7 generations of people that are tied to that land and that have been loving and managing that land for that long, it's pretty humbling to see some of the history that's tied to lands in Colorado.
Absolutely. And for mine, I wanted to share the story of the Hotchkiss family out of Hotchkiss in Colorado. I happened to be kind of in the area on another shoot with a videographer. I think I was out in Paonia, and our project manager had just closed this the conservation easement on the Hotchkiss property. And he said, "Hey, this family is so cool. Will you just go meet them and get their story? Because I think you'll get a lot out of it." So I took the videographer out there, and we show up in this beautiful historic house, high ceilings, big windows, and this lovely couple. And the matriarch of the Hotchkiss family, she shared with me that their house was part of the founding of the town, and the one room in it used to be the post office, and the other room was the funeral home. So lots of stories in that house, but she did tell me that when her husband was ranching, I think this would have been maybe the 50s and 60s, they didn't have much going on at the house in time when he would, take the herds of sheep around. He might not be back for 3-4 days, but every once in a while he would find something on the land, like a shard of a bottle from bootleggers, and he would bring it home to her, and she was just so excited because it meant something had happened that week that was a little different than her normal week. So it was really cool to talk to her. I want to ask Tony, and I want to give you the last word in this segment, but to share a story about an experience you had on private land that was particularly special to you. And I'm going to give mine first again to give you the last word. Another time I was out with the videographer. I'm the communications director, so I get sent out with the cameras and all the tech. We were shooting the sunrise, and it was at Park County. We really wanted to get there before dawn. My team and I, with the camera, we went up this mountain pass, and it was overlooking an easement that we had closed the prior year. And the landowner doesn't like his name used, so I'm not going to share it. But it was fall. We were surrounded by aspens, and as the sun came up, the whole field below us, we could see 6, 10, 20 miles. The whole thing just turned bright gold. And it was just an experience that I know I'll never forget. But Tony, can you share a story from private land that really sticks out in your mind?
Sure. When I started this job a little over 10 years ago, one of the first things I tried to do was get out and see some of the conserved properties that Colorado Open Lands had been working on in the past. And one particular property I visited was Arapahoe Ranch near Nederland. It was one of the first conservation easements that COL has done, and it was a opportunity to meet the landowner, and then she invited me just to take a walk across this sprawling historic ranch. And I watched, as I was walking, I noticed that there was a mother moose with 2 babies, and she was sort of just grooming and hanging out with her calves there on the edge of a pond on the property. And I was thinking about where we were, in a place where to the south was Netherland High School and a ski resort up in Eldora, a bustling town to the east, a very popular recreational area to the west, and just thinking about what a little oasis this 640-acre ranch provided for this one family of moose, and how important that was. And it just really brought home for me that these individual projects can really be the entire universe for wildlife like that. So it was just a moment that I had to reflect on the impact of this conservation work on wildlife.
Wonderful. And, when I think about Colorado Open Lands being in business for 44 years, having done hundreds of projects, the stories that even our staff could tell could fill 10 lifetimes of podcasts. But for now, we'll move on and wrap it up. Given everything we've talked about, give me the final word on how you would say the average Coloradan benefits from private land conservation.
When I think about that question, it makes me just stop and want to think about what makes me feel good about living in Colorado. And a lot of folks in Colorado have lived other places, so there's a reason why we're here. And there's almost no way you can think about why you love living in Colorado without it being tied in some way to the land and water. Those natural resources that we have in the state are really unlike anywhere else in the nation. And it really defines who we are and why we live here. And I can bet that almost anybody that would say why they love Colorado, it would be a reason that was tied to the land and water here. Whether it's hiking, fishing, scenic drives, just being able to look out your window, even if you live in a metropolitan area, to see the plains or to see the mountains, just to know that that's there. I think that that's really why we love being here. And so I feel like the work that we do is really fundamental to protecting the unique lifestyle that we have in Colorado.
Absolutely. And last thing I just want to ask you, if people want to see more private land in Colorado, where can they go or how can they get involved?
Sure. Well, to get involved, I'd encourage folks to explore our website. It talks a lot about our work in general. It talks about specific conservation projects. You can look at resources to understand how can you buy goods and services from protected lands, how can you support land conservation, how can you support the restoration of land and water? There's a lot of programmatic work that we do that not only protects land, but also tries to improve the ecological function of the land. So there's a lot of ways to explore the what we do. But the best way to explore the why we do it is to join us on one of our land tours. We conduct hikes and tours and educational opportunities throughout the year. And there's no better way to appreciate land conservation than to get out on those protected lands to see the impact of this work. So I'd encourage folks to join us.
I hope many of you do. Thank you so much for your time today, Tony.
Thanks for the conversation. This was fun.
This has been Landlines. I'm your host, Leslie Volkar. You can find episodes at coloradoopenlands.org. If you're interested in sponsoring Landlines, please contact me at lvolkar@coloradoopenlands.org.